Welcome to Say More from Boston Globe Opinion. I'm Shirley Leung. 20 years ago, most people did not worry about concussions and how dangerous they can be. But now, head safety is top of mind for athletes and their parents, especially for those playing football. My guest today has taken a lot of hits to the head. Now he's looking out for other people's heads. Chris Nowinski started out as an athlete. He played football at Harvard and later became a pro wrestler. After confronting his own injuries, he got a PhD in neuroscience and co-founded the Concussion Legacy Foundation here in Boston. Chris, welcome to Say More.
Thanks for having me, Shirley.
So, as I said, this issue is couldn't be more personal for you. You've been an athlete for most of your life. You played football at Harvard, and you wrestled in the WWE under the name Chris Harvard. I mean, you're like you can't listeners can't tell, but you're like 6'5". You're a big guy, and you had chairs and trash cans smashed over your head. I mean, did you think you were invincible?
I guess I did. I mean, I am very risk averse now that I've taken a few too many shots to the head. But at the time, I lived almost 20 years of my life in a very reckless manner where I just was not scared of anything. And in football, loved to lead with my head. Never thought twice that my head was throbbing or that I was hit somebody so hard that I would taste blood in my mouth, and never thought what that could be doing inside my brain, that kind of energy. And then WWE, it was just at a time when chair shots were normal and everyone seemed to be doing it. And so you get involved and you just say, sure, hit me. and part of the problem is you can't feel pain in your brain. And so you don't realize what you're doing to yourself.
So when you hurt your head, I mean, what was that experience like? And did you ever see a doctor about it?
No, when I was at Harvard, I never said a word about it. And after meeting Dr. Robert Cantu, who's out at Emerson Hospital in Concord, he was the one who really got me to understand at the age of 25 what a concussion was. And so looking back, I could remember times when I got hit in the head and the sky would go orange on me and I'd sort of wobble to the sideline and recover and not say anything. Or I would see double for a while, or, I would forget sort of where we were. And the big one, the one that sort of ended my career, I was in the ring wrestling in a tag team match against the Dudley Boys, and I got kicked in the chin so hard that when I hit the ground, I really forgot where we were. And I couldn't remember the rest of the match. And my head was throbbing. But at that time, we weren't trained to stop the match and realize that there's been a brain injury and it's unsafe to continue. And we just kept going. And I just kept asking what to do next. And that was the one that turned into basically 15 years of chronic symptoms that I could never get rid of. And part of the problem was because I still never told anybody about how bad that was and kept wrestling for another 5 weeks. And that sort of did me in, as I understand it now.
So what made you go see Dr. Cantu?
Well, Dr. Cantu is actually the 8th doctor that was sort of trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So the reason I stopped after those 5 weeks of wrestling through a concussion was because I developed something called REM behavior disorder. So REM is rapid eye movement sleep. So when you sleep and you dream, your brain sort of shuts down your limbs so you don't move around and do the actions that you're doing in your dream. And that sort of broke for me from the brain injury. And I started acting out my dreams. And what scared me straight was the first time it happened, I woke up in a hotel room, learning that I'd tried to climb the wall, and I jumped through a nightstand acting out a dream and didn't remember any of it. And when I told the WWE what had happened, they said, all right, you're done until we figure out what's wrong with your brain. And then when we figured that out, I'd just taken too many hits. And so Dr. Cantu is doctor number 8, but he was the first one to really pull out of me the information he needed. The other doctors would say, how many concussions have you had before this? And in 2003, my answer was 0. I wasn't even sure if the last one was a concussion because I didn't really understand what it was. And we didn't educate athletes in a good way. We didn't educate coaches. So it wasn't part of the cultural conversation. If you were knocked out, we thought you had a concussion. And other than that, it was a very gray issue. So he was the one to help me remember all of these very specific memories that I had concussions and not said anything, and taught me that, by continuing to play through all those concussions, I made each one a little worse and probably created cumulative damage that was resulting in these chronic symptoms.
So how many concussions do you think you had that were undiagnosed?
So at that time, when I wrote a book called Head Games in 2006, and I talked about 6 specific memories. Now, I would say the number is definitely over 20, partially because
Wow.
I've gotten so many since. My wife made me stop playing basketball with a bunch of great guys in Boston. Shout out to the Shad Nation because they kept elbowing me in the head. But so I had to stop that. And then, but the funny thing is, we don't talk about concussions. So a couple years ago, I went home for Christmas, and my mom is pulling out sort of, old things to show me and trying to sort of clear out my stuff from the house. And she gave me discharge papers from the hospital. She's like, "Oh, by the way, I found this. When you were 4, you fell off of a table and you got a concussion. We took you to the hospital."
Oh,
And I'm like, "Oh, great. So that's another one I didn't even know
wow.
about." And my whole life is concussions. And then she also then handed me a picture of me and my dad both icing our heads, looking foggy after wrestling. And that was a separate issue. And I'm like 5. And I'm like, so honestly, I don't think any of us really know how many concussions we had because we've lived in this world where we just never thought twice about it.
So you saw Dr. Cantu, and he tells you you've had all these concussions. So what's happening to you now?
Yeah, this is 21 years ago. And honestly, my perception of what's happening to me changes all the time, really with the latest science. And so if you think about my journey, so in 2003, I realized, okay, I definitely have this thing we're calling post-concussion syndrome back then. Now we're sort of calling it persistent post-concussion symptoms. And I'm trying to get better. That sends me on this research odyssey where I'm going, okay, how do I fix my brain? And so guided by Dr. Cantu, I'm going to the Harvard Medical School library and I'm photocopying every study and I'm going, what's the fast track? And I realized, oh, this is much more serious than I realized. We've known for 100 years concussions were bad. We weren't talking about it. But also, I start reading about this disease, CTE. At that time, I got hurt just at the right time when the first NFL player was diagnosed. And that became very interesting to me because it made a lot of sense for me that this disease we used to call punch drunk in boxers would also be found in football players. Your brain doesn't know what's hitting it. And so at that time, part of the reason I partnered with Dr. Cantu to start the Concussion Legacy Foundation was to build a brain bank to start to study CT to figure out, geez, is this also something that I need to worry about? And so we sought out and found Dr. Ann McKee to lead that brain bank. And we now have helped recruit 1,500 athletes for study. At the beginning of this, I wasn't sure if I had CTE. Now I look at it and I go, actually, there's a decent chance I do.
Mm-hmm.
But on the bright side, I wasn't sure if I was ever going to get better from where I was 20 years ago. Like 20 years ago was hell. 20 years ago was, sleeping like a lunatic, constant headaches. I couldn't exercise without getting nauseous. I was a miserable person to be around. All my, friendships are falling apart. Relationships are falling apart. I'm isolating myself. I got better from that. That's the good news, is that today at 45, I honestly would say I feel amazing relative to what I did 20 years ago.
So you mentioned going through, sleep problems, behavioral problems. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the darker symptoms of CTE?
Well, so what I was going through, I would attribute to the brain injuries, right? So I don't know if I have CT, and if I do right now, it's not affecting me in a meaningful way. When we talk about trying to understand what are the dark symptoms that are related to CTE, it's really hard to say. So when we talk about CTE publicly, we talk about Aaron Hernandez.
Right.
We go, okay, Aaron Hernandez had stage 3 disease in his 20s, and he went from, maybe a petty criminal with a bad attitude to somebody who was murdering people, even though he was a multimillionaire and his life was set.
Yeah.
Right. And so we think about these extreme cases. We think about Junior Seau and his suicide. We think about these sort of high profile incidents. In reality, we don't know in those situations whether what they went through was due to CTE, was due to them having a lot of concussions, or was completely unrelated to any pathology or brain injury. Right? And all those things are possible. in those cases.
Mhm.
So I think about somebody like my captain at Harvard, Chris Eitzman. Great guy. Like when you're elected as the sole Harvard captain, it's sort of a stamp that you are a great leader and great person. And he went on to play 3 years in the NFL, shared a house with Tom Brady as rookie with the Patriots. When he left, he went and got his MBA at Dartmouth, and then, worked at some very prestigious Boston firms, last at Putnam. And then we found out was hiding extreme and extraordinary alcohol problem that a number of his closest friends tried to intervene in the last year of his life. And basically, there was nothing, they put every resource in the world possible to help him. And it couldn't stop him from drinking himself to death.
Mm.
And when his brain was studied, he had stage 2 CTE.
Mm.
I've seen that story play out dozens of times in the brain bank. So I tend to, I think about these extraordinary football players who were great people who have these extreme changes in personality and basically choose to drink themselves to death, in a sense. That I think that's the disease, because people do recover from alcoholism, but these guys, I'm amazed at how they are not able to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I think those things are related, but I can never be certain, because science, pathology does not determine behavior one-to-one. And so they're still gray, but I think we need to pay attention to these things as we try to help people prevent this, and think about what do we do about a problem that we are creating in, basically, we confidently say, hundreds of thousands of American athletes.
More of my conversation with Chris Nowinski after this short break. Hi, Say More listeners. A quick note that the second half of this episode contains mentions of suicide. Take care while listening. So last year, Boston University released a study looking at the brains of around 150 athletes who died before the age of 30, searching for CTE. And 40% of those brains tested positive for CTE. And what was so eye-opening was that CTE was found in high school athletes. And I want you to talk about one of those kids, Wyatt Bramwell, who died by suicide. And he actually made a video before he died. We're going to play a little bit here. And in the video, you see this clean-cut 18-year-old kid. He's wearing a light pink collared shirt, and he's sitting in the driver's seat of his car.
Dad, I know you're capable of doing this, and I want you to do it. After my funeral, which will be an open casket, I want my brain donated to be studied. I feel like it'll be closure for me, and it'll be closure for you guys to know that maybe Wyatt suffered from brain damage. Maybe that was the reason. So do that for yourself. I would like that to be done. I want you all to be happy that I'm free and that I can rest easy, because my life for the past 4 years has been living hell inside of my head.
So you spent time with Wyatt's family. Tell me his story.
So Wyatt, was this sweet kid, beloved by everybody. Started playing tackle football in 3rd grade, was a very good player, played both ways for many of those years. His dad was his coach. They actually were aware of CTE and believed that, the more hits to the head you get, the greater your risk, which is generally true. And so they thought, well, we shouldn't be a lineman even though he was tall. Let's make him a wide receiver. And so they sort of were conscious of this and trying to avoid it. But Wyatt started having real mental health struggles his freshman year of high school. He talked a lot about racing thoughts, anxiety, and he was really struggling. It's very sad to sort of see that video, and I feel like I have a window into what he was going through, having sort of been there myself, but in my 20s with these chronic symptoms. And unfortunately, he chose suicide. And there's a couple lessons here, but the scientific insight was that he did have stage 2 CTE. He was the first teenager to be that advanced. And publications have shown it generally takes about 12 years between stages. So the idea is like he must have gotten CT very young.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't have gotten it a year or two prior. And then it progressed. And so that is a tragedy in itself. And I do want to talk about the idea that we are giving children a degenerative brain disease that will affect them for the rest of their life before they even understand what it is and who they want to be. The other part of that has to be discussed, though, is that we cannot be certain that the CTE was necessarily driving those symptoms. In my personal opinion, it's probably more likely that the chronic concussions he had that got him to the place where he got CT, because you aren't going to really get CT unless you have a lot of hard hits that are damaging your brain. So though that damage, in theory, with the right rehabilitation, the right treatment, the cessation of taking more hits to the head, he could have recovered from.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyone who's listening to this who thinks they might have CT, who's in this sort of position where they're symptomatic and they're relatively young, a message to them is, even if you do, you can have 50 more, great years, or longer ahead of you.
Mm-hmm.
Do not conflate the idea of this neurodegenerative disease with the acute concussion symptoms that you are dealing with, and do take time to recover from, but you definitely can recover from.
Mm-hmm.
But the other public health lesson for the rest of us is we have to start asking ourselves, what are we doing to these kids?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I am very bothered as a football player who I very vividly remember being recruited to the game because I was big, by people who at that time certainly thought they were doing the best for me, did not understand the risks. But now that we do, are we doing enough to prevent children from getting CT? And I think the answer is very clearly no.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, there's been sort of denial about the issue. We're not acknowledging it. We're not educating parents. We're not talking about CTE, even though this study was critical in showing that 63 people who died before 30, all of whom started as young athletes, developed CTE and somehow died before 30, often related to mental health issues.
Mm-hmm. I want to play one more clip from Wyatt's video. What struck me is that he was very self-aware. He talked about taking a lot of hits to the head.
And a lot of times I never told anybody about how I was feeling in my head after a hit. I just kind of kept playing, which was not smart on my end. I know that.
It's almost like he's blaming himself. But I couldn't help think, what about all the adults in his life? Who's failing these kids?
So this is sort of an essential question that we need to be very honest with people about. Wyatt's behavior is not abnormal at all. In fact, in my mind, it's sometimes the only way you can play football, because you get so many hits that can cause these sort of short-term symptoms, what we used to call a ding. All of us now will honestly talk about over dinner, the number of times you had a 10-second you felt stunned is uncountable. And by definition, those might be concussions, but we don't know. Right. So Wyatt did what every player is sort of doing. And the lesson I think we need to take away is we'll probably never be able to convince teenagers to self-report their concussions when they know it'll pull them out of the game, pull them out of the thing they love, put them on a sideline where they can't play with their friends in a public forum, when people are counting on them. There is no magic way to get kids to report, and there probably never will be. And therefore, it's our responsibility to reduce the odds that they're going to get these brain injuries. That means it's our job to change how we play these games. And that's why I say, for something like tackle football, we encourage people not to enroll their kids in tackle, to choose flag football before high school, because there's so much you can't control. You can't teach a 10-year-old how to self-diagnose their concussion. And there's no athletic trainer there to help them. And it's just all these risks that aren't necessary if you want to just have them have the experience of high school football and other aspects.
What are some of the changes you'd like to see when kids play football?
Well, yeah, it starts with, a couple of years ago at the Concussion Legacy Foundation, we changed the campaign to protect kids to just calling it Stop Hitting Kids in the Head. Mm. So the idea is we really just need to be focusing on prevention at that point. We are never going to be able to diagnose every concussion and protect them. And all this has had lead to CT. So whether it's football or soccer or rugby, we shouldn't be tackling. We shouldn't be heading soccer balls. None of that before 14. It doesn't make sense to me as an ex-athlete and neuroscientist who sees these downstream effects. Then we need to do everything we can to minimize the number of hits to the head for these athletes. So every coach should have the goal of how do I teach the sport of football with the minimum number of head hits in practice, and potentially the goal being 0.
So I have a lot of thoughts in my head right now. And the most pressing thought is personal. I have an 11-year-old. He has literally begged me to play tackle football because all his buddies from his basketball team are playing football. And I finally relented this spring. I signed him up. I mean, even just talking about it creates a pit in my stomach. And so am I making the wrong decision? What do I do? I mean, he's literally this morning at breakfast, I said, I'm talking to this guy named Chris Nowinski about football and head injuries. And I don't think he wants you to play football at such a young age. And Evan's like telling me, you don't want me to fulfill my dreams. It's like, you don't want me to play with my friends. And I don't know what to do about it. I'm literally, when I signed the form, you can pay for extra insurance so that you can pull out and get your money back. So I feel like I'm still tossing and turning over this one.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. That is a very difficult situation, and it's not just a question of CTE and concussion. So I won't presume to know everything that goes into this decision, but there's no upside from a development perspective. Like if you want your son to experience football and be good at football, you don't need to play before high school. His brain is still developing in a very different way than it will be in 5 years. Mm-hmm. You're watching him evolve from a child into an adolescent, into a teenager. And what you're seeing is actually his brain changing every day, rearranging itself to become an adult and start thinking like an adult. So you can change that developmental process with brain injuries in this time. It's sort of what they call a critical window of development.
You're right. I'm not worried about CTE. I'm worried about him getting hurt.
But you should be.
I'm worried about, my primary concern is him getting hurt. I'm worried about concussions. I'm worried about broken arms. You don't worry about that.
About broken arms. They heal. Brains don't heal.
Right.
The only thing you should be thinking about is brain.
Yeah. Okay.
All other sports have risks of various injuries.
Right.
Your brain is you sort of feel silly to say this, but we have to sometimes. Your brain is by far more important than any other part of their body.
Right. And it's hard to heal your brain. Broken arms, broken legs, broken ankles.
Broken arms heal stronger.
Yeah.
But you can't, if he damages his brain, he may not get it all back.
Yeah.
And other stats you should think about. Your odds of developing CT are going up. The data says today somewhere between 15 and 30% per year he plays. So if you haven't played 3 years before high school, you could double his risk of CTE.
Yeah. Is there any way to make football safe for kids under 14?
Tackle football?
Tackle football, yes.
Again, there's not a safe or not safe question. It's really, this is a subjective issue. But my personal opinion is there's absolutely no reason to expose kids to 500 hits to their head before their brain is, even close to being matured. So if the question is, should my kid play football? Let me put it another way. Would you hit your kid in the head 500 times? And if not, why not? Right? And it's because it's bad for them.
Yeah. So why isn't it just banned? Why can't we?
That's an interesting question.
Why can't we ban football for under 14? So I don't have to have torture myself because I really don't. I don't want my son to play football. I really don't. I wish it wasn't an option.
Choices, right? Smoking is not an option for your kids right now. Going in the car without a seatbelt is not an option for you, right? You don't have to make that choice every time. It's the law. If you actually review the science in a sober fashion, you can convince people this should not be available for children. But can you get that to be a bill in the United States? Probably not. And so you will have to make that choice for yourself. And I don't know, I have 2 kids myself. My son's only 3, so I don't have to have this discussion with him now. But you can sort of stand here in your ivory tower and say, well, yeah, but if your kid wanted to go, play in traffic with his friends, would you say, go ahead? No, you sort of know where the line is. This one is hard because you cannot see the damage they're doing. And scientists cannot see the damage they're doing, right? We are basically, seeding in their brain the potential for this disease that we will not know, and you will not know. You may not know if he got, and because you will, in theory, all parents want to die before their kids. Mm-hmm. And so it's very hard to learn what we've done to our kids with this situation because the parents never sort of find out. And so it's sort of parents like the Bramwells who sort of give us this window by giving us this generous donation to say, oh, they now know. But even Wyatt Bramwell's mother said she would have let it do it again because of the joy it brought him, and because we can't, be certain that his suicide or his symptoms were caused by what was in his brain. So this is not an easy question. Mm-hmm. But my personal opinion is I would absolutely just say no and work very hard to manage the emotional response you'd have from your son, mm-hmm. because I bet you could manage that. But if your son started to have concussion problems or CT issues, I can't promise you could manage that.
I mean, you've experienced the joy of sports. You've also experienced the downsides with your head injuries and your symptoms and the work you do now. So knowing what you know now, I mean, would you have still played football? Would you have still become a pro wrestler?
It's a great question. I mean, so it's one of those things like in an N of one, right? Like if I don't have CTE, football was a very positive experience for me. If I do, it will probably send me to a difficult death and be a problem for my family and my kids. And then it would absolutely not be worth it. So I sort of live in this world where I don't know. And it's a fair thing to say. Other than the possibility my brain is rotting because I played football, I enjoyed it. And I've seen again what these deaths do to people, and I was just in Chicago last week with 10 families who donated the brains of their loved ones, and one of them was the daughter of a guy who played at one of my rival high schools. He died at 64, and he was a great, 5'6" running back who was just known as being a tough guy. And we just gave him the diagnosis in the last few months. And his daughter's, probably, in her 30s, came to this event, and she told me that realizing that he had stage 4 CTE, the most advanced stage at 64 when he died, was the first time in her life she felt like she could love her father. Because he was such a monster her entire life. And that is the stuff that keeps me up, of having young kids going, I'm fine now, but if this thing takes hold, like, will they be those kids telling stories about, dad was great. I don't remember the good dad. I remember the bad dad. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so that's what you think about.
So if you could leave our listeners with one final note on this issue, what would it be?
For the parents listening, like if you're born blessed enough to have a kid with a healthy brain, try not to do anything to screw that up. And that means, you can find other ways to teach them every lesson you want to teach them without exposing them to thousands of hits to the head, the risk of CTE, or, too many concussions. So take their brain health, especially with trauma prevention, much more seriously. But the other side of that coin is that if anyone feels like they're in that bucket where they've been hitting the head too much and they're worried, know that there is help out there, and that even we're learning from these terrible stories. Most stories are not as terrible, and if you do need help, if you're worried at all, I would encourage people to reach out to the Concussion Legacy Foundation helpline, clfhelpline.org, and we will help you get through this.
Chris Nowinski is the CEO of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, which is based here in Boston. He's a researcher at Boston University and co-founder of the Unite Brain Bank. Thank you, Chris, for joining us on Say More.
Thank you, Shirley.
Say More is a production of the Boston Globe. Today's episode was produced by Anna Kussmer. Our editor is Jim Dow. Our engineer is Uzair Ahmed. Our music is from APM Music. If you like the show, please follow us and leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email us at saymore@globe.com. I'm Shirley Leung. Thanks for listening.